everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lottie and this is my August wrap up. In August I completed the total of 4 books and they happen to equal 1,800 pages exactly. If I compare that to what I read in July I read 1,737 pages, but I read 7 books. So even though I have read less books in August, I have actually read more pages, which I am really pleased about. I'm trying to see kind of reading achievement as being more about page count rather than about the number of books that I have read each month. So in August I read 2 fantasy books, I read a non-fiction, and I also read a horror. 3 of the books were young adult and 1 of them was adult. So first of all, I'm going to talk about Me by Elton John. This is his autobiography detailing his life basically from when he was born up until now. This was a reread for me. I first read it last year on audiobook. I wanted to read the paperback because it has a new chapter covering the last year or so of his life. I rated it 5 stars yet again. It's absolutely brilliant, it's funny, it's heartfelt, and I love hearing about Elton John's life. I think he is such an incredible human and he has lived such an amazing life. I knew who he was, but I didn't really pay attention to who he was until I saw Rocketman for the first time last year, and I have been obsessed with him ever since. I started this in June for Whatever You Want-a-thon hosted by Maddie from Book Browsing Blog. I ended up sort of putting it on hold for quite a while. I would pick it up and read a couple of chapters and then put it down again for quite a while and then pick it up again. I finally finished it in August just because it's quite slow going, especially in the start. I feel like a lot of what happens, not necessarily the beginning, more towards the end of the beginning of the book, can be quite slow going, and I felt the same way when I read it for the first time. I started the audiobook and then put it down for quite a while and then I raced through the very end. I think that it's because at the point where I was putting it down was quite a difficult time in Elton's life. It was when he was at the height of battling with his addiction, and it's obviously quite a difficult thing to read about. So I think that's why I ended up putting it down every so often. But I'm really glad I managed to actually finish it. What I really like about this edition is of course that it comes with a new chapter, and that covers essentially the release of the Rocketman film up until COVID, Elton talking about what happened during that year of his life. And also I really like that the physical edition has photographs from Elton's life. So one of my favourite ones is this photograph here of him dressed as Ronald McDonald performing on stage with George Michael. And obviously you don't really get all of that by listening to it on audio, but I do still really love the audiobook. It's narrated by Taron Egerton, who plays Elton John in the Rocketman film. It's like hearing an extension, I guess, of Rocketman. Really loved this. It was just quite slow going in parts. Next I'm going to talk about Witchshadow by Susan Dennard. This is the 4th book in the Witchland series. I've been reading this series as a part of the Witchlands Along hosted by Jade from Jodie Ray Reads. We are finally completing that read along. There is 1 more book to still come out for this series. I think it's supposed to be released in 2023. I'm really because I need to know what happens next. So this book has been quite dividing in the book community. A lot of people didn't like it, but this was actually my favourite book of the whole series. Really liked the reveals and the confirmations of this things that all of us for the Witchlands Long were speculating on. I enjoyed reading more about Iseult and seeing more of her perspective, and I actually quite liked the flashback format of it. So this book takes place a month after the end of Blood Witch. For the first half at least, it goes back and forth between what is happening in the present and flashbacks of what happened during that month that we missed as readers, and I quite liked having those flashbacks. I thought it was an interesting way to tell the story. I can understand why a lot of people would have preferred to see what was happening during those flashbacks as they were happening rather than as flashbacks, but I quite liked it being that. I think it kept things interesting. I feel like this book was the easiest to understand in the whole of the Witchlands, apart from maybe Sight Witch. I think Sight Witch was the easiest just because of the way it was written, whereas the rest of the books in the series were quite confusing for me, and this one I feel like I understood quite a lot more and it was more straightforward for me. I found it exciting, it was intriguing, and like I said, I would really love to see how things end. I did rate it 5 stars, but I can see how a lot of other people in the book community might have rated it a lot lower after hearing like their thoughts and things. I don't think it was necessarily the best written, but again, I kind of feel that way about all of the books in this series. The writing itself can be quite confusing in my opinion, apart from Sight Witch, which I've said previously on my channel, if all of the books were written like Sight Witch, I think it would be a really strong series. And I don't necessarily think the writing style is anything against Susan Dennard as a writer. I think it's the way her publisher has asked her to write the series. So in the UK this is targeted for adults, but in the US I think it's targeted for young adults, and so it has the pacing of a young adult fantasy but the complexity of a adult fantasy, which makes things quite jarring. The series also follows a lot of different perspectives, and by this point in the book nearly everyone is split up, so we are seeing a lot of different things happening. And I do kind of wish that like the chapters had maybe the character's name in the heading so we knew exactly who we were seeing. 2 of the characters in this, Vanessa and Vivia, their particular perspectives I found really boring. I didn't enjoy them at all, and a lot of people have said that they were the ones that made the most sense, but I didn't pay attention to their perspectives at all. If we see a lot more of them come book 5, I'm not going to know what on earth was happening, but everything that was happening with Iseult and Safi I was really invested in. I would probably say this is my favourite in the series. With a little bit of reflection, I think I still enjoyed Sight Witch. I'm not going to lower my rating for this. I still think it was 5 stars for me just because how much I really loved it when I finished it, but I'm thinking maybe it's more like a 4.5 after some reflection. This series is really hard to describe what exactly it's about. The first book follows 2 characters, Safi and Iseult. Safi is a truth witch and Iseult is a thread witch, and they are like found family. They're like sisters to each other, and they are on the run from a blood witch named Adjuan because of something that they did. The first book is essentially following them on the run from Adjuan, things that happen along the way and different characters that they meet. By this point in the series, that initial plot is sort of irrelevant to what is actually happening. And one of my main criticisms of this series is that the main plot is really unclear. I'm not sure what the end game is supposed to be, because so far we've had lots of reveals of things, but there doesn't seem to be anything, like any major goal that all of these things are leading towards. Really wondering like how this series is going to end, and I'm a little bit worried that when the series does end it's not going to be satisfactory, because it'll probably feel a bit like, oh, that was it, because I don't have a clear idea of what the goal is supposed to be. I feel like the more I talk about this book, the more I talk myself out of liking it, but I did really like it. It was really good, and the thing about this series is it gets better as it goes along, but I think if you push yourself through Truth Witch, you can let yourself in for something that is really exciting. The next book that I finished was The Fallen by Charlie Higson. This is the 5th book in the Enemy series, which is a young adult horror post-apocalyptic series set in London, where everybody over the age of 14 has gotten this disease that turns them into zombie-like children-eating monsters. The first 4 books in this series are sort of playing catch-up, and by this point we are all caught up with all the characters. So each book follows a different set of characters, and this one is the aftermath of what happens in the first book. It's really complicated to explain. The second book takes place a year before the first book. The third book takes place a few days before the first book, and then the 4th book and this book run consecutively. They take place just after the first book. It sounds complex, but it's not, and once you start reading it, things start to make sense. I rated this 4 stars. This was a lot more exciting to me than The Sacrifice, which was the 4th book. I really enjoyed seeing characters from the first book come back finally, and I was really intrigued by how it ended and what is going to happen to the characters in the next book. This series, although it's young adult, reads very adult. It's really graphic, violent and gory. There is a lot of descriptions of the grossness of the grown-ups who are the zombies, and also how people are murdered and mauled and just attacked. The writing style itself is the complete opposite, so although it has a lot of graphic descriptions in it, the writing style is very juvenile in my opinion, and that's always what it misses the mark for me. This reads very young, reads much more on the younger spectrum of young adult. I would definitely say this is more targeted towards like 13 and 14 year olds rather than 17 and 18 year olds, but I still really enjoy it. I think it's exciting, it's scary, and the fact that it's set in London as well gives it that extra creep factor. I'm really excited to move on to the next book, which I think was The Hunted, and to see how this series will end. I've only got 2 books left and I'm like, oh my god, like what is going to happen? Are they going to be able to find a cure? Are they just going to live forever with these horrible grown-ups? And there's also the looming question of what happens to the kids once they turn 15 themselves. Most of the series is taking place a year after the initial disease appeared, so anyone who was 14 at the time is now 15, 16 years old, and we are starting to see whether or not the disease is affecting them as they've grown up, or was it just everyone who was over the age of 15 at the time when the disease first appeared. I really like the sci-fi elements of this as well. You get a lot more background into where the disease came from in this book, and it feels very realistic, but also you can tell that it's like made up, which is a little bit more reassuring that it's not something that could really happen in the world. When I read the last book in the series, it was just as like COVID was coming into existence, and it was a very scary thing, and I think that might have affected my enjoyment of the sacrifice because it was almost like it was happening to us in real life, and I didn't like that. But I'm really glad that I am able to enjoy this series once more because I really love it. It's just great. And finally, the last book that I finished in August was Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. I have been reading this series for the very first time and documenting it on my channel. I've got a spoilery vlog all about this book if you are interested in watching that. I'm going to give my spoiler-free thoughts here. So this is obviously the second book in the Throne of Glass series, and I think I loved it. The more I sit on this one, the more I'm enjoying it, whereas the opposite really was with Witchshadow. I did actually rate this 4 stars, but I'm thinking it's probably leaning more towards a 4.5 or a 5. It was just super exciting. I didn't like Throne of Glass, and I kind of expected to not like it because everything I've been told is that Throne of Glass is not Sarah J. Maas's strongest book. It's obviously the first book she ever wrote, and it's not that well written. And again, with this, I don't think it was that well written, but it was much better in terms of the pacing and what was happening with the plot and the characterization. I was just so much more invested in what was happening with the characters in this book. I also liked that romance of Sarah J. Maas's writing was more present in this book. So obviously the romantic relationships Selena has are much more present in this book, and Sarah J. Maas's romance is something I love about her books. So I'm hoping that with the next few books in the series, romance starts creeping in more and more, because that's what I read her books for, the romance and not just the fantasy. And the reveals in this were super exciting. They didn't necessarily surprise me as much as they could have had I not known anything about this series, but I've been trying to go into this without knowing too much, so hopefully I'll keep being surprised as we go along. This was just super exciting. I'm really excited for Air of Fire. I really wish that it was on my September TBR because I just want to read it immediately, but I have to wait. I love this. It was great. So when I was planning this video, I did think that Witchshadow was my favourite book of the month because it's the book that I rated the highest, but I actually think I'm leaning more towards Crown of Midnight being my favourite book of the month, even though I rated this 4 stars and this 5 stars. So I guess my favourite book of August is tied between these two, and although I rated it 5 stars, I would have to say Me was my most disappointing book of the month, just because it took me so long to get through. It is a little bit of a slog, so I'm really sorry, Elton, this was just my most disappointing, even though I still really loved it. I had a pretty good reading month in August, so it was difficult to choose what was my most disappointing, but it was probably, sadly, Me. And then my most surprising book was The Fallen. I went into this a little bit apprehensive because I didn't enjoy the sacrifice as much, but this surprised me because I really loved it, and it made me really excited to continue on with the series. So these are all the books that I read during August. Let me know in the comments below if you have read any of these books and what you thought about them. I think I had a pretty good reading month. It doesn't look like I read that much, but I feel like I did read quite a lot, and I did constantly read. There wasn't really a point in the month where I wasn't reading anything, and I feel like I'm finally out of that reading slump that was killing me slowly. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you would like to see more of my videos. That's it from me today, so thank you so much. Bye!